The German bomber crew never saw what killed them. One moment they were cruising at 12,000 feet through the moonless French sky, confident in the darkness that had protected them for years. The next, their aircraft exploded into a fireball of shredded aluminum and burning fuel. No warning, no tracer rounds streaking through the night, just sudden, absolute death delivered by an invisible hunter they never knew existed. The Junkers Ju-88 disintegrated over the countryside, while its killers, seated in the cockpit of a massive black twin-engine fighter bristling with radar antennas and cannon, banked away to search for their next victim. For the Luftwaffe, the rules of night combat had just been rewritten by a machine they never expected to face. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Lieutenant Robert Hayes gripped the control yoke of his P-61 Black Widow as he scanned the darkness beyond his cockpit canopy on this cold February night in 1945. The 24-year-old pilot from Oregon had been flying combat missions over Europe for 3 months, but the transition from daylight fighters to night operations still felt surreal. Behind him, separated by a bulkhead, radar operator Lieutenant James Caldwell hunched over his SCR-720 radar scope, watching the green phosphorescent blips that represented aircraft moving through the invisible world of radio waves. The Black Widow was unlike anything else in the sky, and tonight would prove exactly why the Germans had no answer for it. The aircraft was enormous for a fighter, with a wingspan of 66 feet and weighing over 28,000 pounds, fully loaded. Its twin Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines produced over 2,000 horsepower each, pushing the massive aircraft through the air at speeds exceeding 360 miles per hour. The fuselage was painted in glossy black lacquer that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making the aircraft nearly invisible against the night sky. But the Black Widow's most revolutionary feature wasn't visible at all. It was the radar system housed in the aircraft's distinctive nose, allowing crews to find enemy aircraft in complete darkness without ever laying eyes on them until the final moments before firing. Hayes had grown up on a farm outside Portland, spending his childhood fixing tractors and irrigation equipment with his father. That mechanical aptitude had served him well in the Army Air Forces, where he'd quickly distinguished himself as a pilot who understood not just how to fly an aircraft, but how its systems worked together. When the call had come for volunteers to transition to the new P-61 program, he'd jumped at the opportunity. Night fighting was dangerous work, but it also meant hunting the Luftwaffe when they thought they were safe, and that appealed to something deep in Hayes's competitive nature. Contact bearing 015, range 8 miles, Caldwell's voice crackled through the intercom with professional calm. The radar operator had been an electronics technician before the war, working for RCA in New Jersey, and he treated his radar set with the reverence of a craftsman handling precision tools. Looks like a single aircraft, medium size, altitude approximately 10,000 feet. Hayes adjusted his heading, turning the Black Widow onto an intercept course. The radar system was a marvel of technology that most people back home couldn't have imagined. Radio waves, invisible to the human eye, bounced off distant aircraft and returned to the receiver, displaying their position on a cathode ray tube. It was like having electronic vision that could see through darkness, clouds, and weather that would ground every other fighter in the European theater. The Germans knew the Allies had developed radar for ground installations and naval vessels, but they hadn't expected the Americans to miniaturize the technology enough to fit it inside a fighter aircraft with enough reliability to make it combat effective. The development of the P-61 had begun back in 1940, when the Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a dedicated night fighter after observing the devastating effectiveness of German night bombing during the Battle of Britain. Northrop aircraft had responded with a radical design that broke from conventional fighter architecture. Instead of a single fuselage, the Black Widow featured a twin-boom configuration, with the crew nacelle mounted centrally between two engine nacelles. This allowed the radar equipment to be mounted in the nose with an unobstructed forward view, while the twin booms housed the landing gear and supported the tail assembly. 4 20mm cannon were mounted in the belly in a ventral pack that could be removed for maintenance, capable of firing 650 rounds per minute combined. The aircraft also carried 450 caliber machine guns in a dorsal turret, though many crews had this removed to improve performance. Range 5 miles, target maintaining course and speed, Caldwell updated. No indication they've seen us. That was the beauty and the terror of radar-equipped night fighting. The target had no idea death was approaching until cannon fire tore through their aircraft. Traditional night combat had relied on searchlights, visual acquisition, or sheer luck to bring fighters and bombers together in the darkness. It was inefficient, dangerous, and often ineffective. Pilots might patrol for hours without ever making contact, or they might stumble into friendly aircraft by mistake. The Black Widow eliminated that uncertainty, turning night combat from a game of chance into a calculated hunt where the predator always had the advantage. Hayes reduced throttle slightly, not wanting to overtake the target too quickly. The key to successful radar interception was patience, letting the electronics guide you into optimal firing position rather than rushing in and possibly losing contact or alerting the enemy. At 3 miles distance, he began a gentle descent to position himself below and behind the target, the classic blind spot for most aircraft. The Germans still relied primarily on visual observation for defense, posting lookouts to watch for attacking fighters, but those lookouts could only see what their eyes could detect. And a black aircraft approaching from below against the dark ground was essentially invisible. The Luftwaffe's night operations had been a cornerstone of German strategy since the early days of the war. Under cover of darkness, bombers could strike Allied positions, supply depots, and transportation networks with reduced risk from fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed Allied installations without the interference of daylight interceptors. For years, the night had belonged to whoever was bold enough to fly in it, but technical capability rather than courage had been the limiting factor. Now that technical barrier had been shattered by American engineering and industrial capacity. Range 1 mile, Caldwell announced. I'm getting a solid return, definitely a twin-engine aircraft. Could be a Ju-88 or maybe a Heinkel 111. Hayes's pulse quickened despite months of training and combat experience. Every interception carried the possibility of disaster. Equipment could malfunction, targets could take evasive action, or the whole engagement could dissolve into confusion in the three-dimensional darkness. But when everything worked as designed, the P-61 was a nearly perfect killing machine. I'm going to close to visual range, Hayes replied. Keep me updated on position. At half a mile distance, Hayes spotted his target, a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky near the horizon. It was indeed a Junkers Ju-88, one of the Luftwaffe's most versatile aircraft, used for bombing, reconnaissance, and night fighting. This particular example appeared to be configured as a bomber, evident from the external bomb racks visible beneath the wings. The German crew was likely returning from a raid on Allied positions in France or possibly conducting reconnaissance before the expected spring offensive. Whatever their mission, they were about to fail to complete it. Hayes positioned the Black Widow 300 yards directly astern and slightly below the Junkers, the optimal firing position where his target filled the illuminated reticle of his gun sight, but remained unaware of his presence. The 420mm cannon in his ventral pack were loaded with a mixture of high explosive and armor-piercing incendiary rounds, capable of catastrophic damage against an aircraft's vital systems. Unlike machine guns that required sustained fire to accumulate damage, cannon rounds could destroy a target with just a few hits in critical locations. Permission to engage, Hayes said formally, following the protocols drilled into every night fighter crew. Clear to fire, Caldwell confirmed after checking his radar scope one final time to ensure no friendly aircraft were in the area. Hayes pressed the firing button on his control yoke, and the night exploded with violence. 4 streams of 20mm cannon fire tore through the darkness, each round leaving a brief glowing trail as its tracer compound ignited. The shells covered the 300-yard distance in less than a second, striking the Junkers with devastating effect. High explosive rounds detonated against the aircraft's aluminum skin, blasting holes the size of dinner plates through wings and fuselage. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the bomber's structure and ignited fuel lines and hydraulic systems. In the space of 3 seconds, Hayes fired approximately 60 rounds, and at least 24 found their target. The Junkers Ju-88 didn't die immediately. For a moment that seemed to stretch impossibly long, the bomber simply continued flying straight and level, as though nothing had happened. Then, fire blossomed from its port engine, a small flame at first that rapidly grew into a streaming inferno as aviation fuel fed the blaze. The aircraft began a slow roll to the left, gentle at first, but accelerating as control surfaces failed or the pilot lost consciousness. Hayes pulled the Black Widow into a hard bank to avoid debris and watched as the bomber inverted completely before entering a vertical dive. At 4,000 feet altitude, the Junkers exploded, its fuel tanks and possible remaining bomb load detonating simultaneously in a massive fireball that briefly illuminated the countryside below like a malevolent sunset. Hayes felt the familiar mixture of exhilaration and hollow unease that followed every kill. 4 men had just died, German men to be sure, enemy combatants trying to kill Allied soldiers, but men nonetheless with families and lives that had just been erased in 3 seconds of violence. He pushed the thought aside with practiced mental discipline. War demanded such compartmentalization, or the weight of accumulated killing would crush any pilot with a functioning conscience. "Good kill," Caldwell said quietly. "I've got another contact if you're interested, bearing 320. Range 12 miles. "Let's go hunting," Hayes replied, turning the Black Widow onto a new heading. 300 miles away in a concrete bunker outside Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were studying a disturbing pattern of night losses that had emerged over the previous 3 months. Major Klaus Fischer, a career officer who had transitioned from flying to intelligence work after losing an eye over Britain in 1940, traced lines on a large map showing where German aircraft had been lost during night operations. The pattern was unmistakable. Losses had increased dramatically in areas where American forces operated, while remaining relatively stable in sectors where only British forces were present. "The British night fighters we understand," Fischer explained to his assembled staff. "They use radar, we know this. We've developed countermeasures, radar warning receivers, tactics for evading interception. But these American losses are different. No radar warning, no searchlights, no visual acquisition by our crews before being attacked, just sudden catastrophic damage from multiple cannon strikes." A younger officer, Captain Werner Hoffmann, pointed to a specific cluster of losses near Nancy, France. "Could this be advanced anti-aircraft artillery? New proximity fuses, perhaps?" Fischer shook his head with frustration evident in his voice. "The wreckage we've recovered shows patterns consistent with aerial cannon fire, specifically 20-millimeter rounds entering from the rear quarter at level altitude. This is air-to-air combat, but unlike any night fighting we've encountered before. The Americans have developed something new, and we need to understand what it is before we lose the capability to operate at night entirely." The intelligence staff spent hours reviewing survivor testimony, wreckage analysis reports, and intercepts of Allied radio communications. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying from a technical standpoint. The Americans had fielded a night fighter equipped with onboard radar comparable to ground-based systems, with enough range to detect aircraft at distances of several miles. The fighter was fast enough to catch German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, maneuverable enough to position for optimal firing solutions, and heavily armed enough to destroy targets with brief bursts. It was precisely the weapon that German night operations were not equipped to counter. "We need to develop countermeasures immediately," Fischer concluded, though his tone suggested he knew the futility of the suggestion. "Radar warning receivers capable of detecting the American radar frequencies, new tactics for evasive maneuvers, perhaps chaff dispensers to confuse their targeting. But most importantly, we need to inform all crews that the night is no longer safe, that they must maintain vigilance even in total darkness." But by February 1945, the Luftwaffe's ability to develop and deploy new countermeasures had been severely degraded by years of attrition, bombing of research facilities, and fuel shortages that limited training. Even if effective countermeasures could be designed, producing them in sufficient quantities and distributing them to operational units would take months that Germany no longer had. The appearance of the P-61 Black Widow in European skies had arrived at precisely the moment when the Luftwaffe was least capable of responding effectively. Back over occupied France, Hayes and Caldwell were stalking their second target of the night. This interception was progressing more slowly than the first, as the target aircraft seemed to be following an erratic course, possibly conducting reconnaissance photography or deliberately maneuvering to avoid detection. Hayes found himself constantly adjusting heading and altitude to maintain pursuit, while Caldwell worked to keep the radar locked onto their quarry as it weaved through the night. "He's turning again, now heading 090, Caldwell reported with slight frustration creeping into his normally calm voice. "Either this pilot is paranoid or he's conducting a search pattern for something." "Can you tell what type of aircraft?" Hayes asked, banking the Black Widow to follow the target's latest turn. "Radar return suggests something smaller than the last target, possibly a single-engine type, but I can't be certain at this range." The possibility of a single-engine aircraft complicated the tactical picture considerably. Most German single-engine types were fighters, which meant this could be an enemy night fighter hunting for Allied bombers. Engaging another fighter was significantly more dangerous than attacking a bomber, as fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and equipped specifically for air-to-air combat. The P-61 had advantages in radar detection and heavy armament, but in a turning fight at close range, those advantages could disappear quickly. Hayes decided to proceed with caution, closing to within a mile but maintaining vigilance for any sign that the target had detected his presence. The Black Widow's size was a double-edged sword in these situations. Its large wing area and relatively low wing loading gave it surprisingly good maneuverability for its size, capable of turning with many smaller fighters. But it was still a 28,000-pound aircraft fighting against physics, unable to match the instantaneous turn rates of purpose-built dogfighters. As Hayes closed within visual range, he identified the target as a Focke-Wulf 190, one of Germany's best single-engine fighters. This particular example had been modified for night operations with flame dampeners on the exhaust stacks and what appeared to be primitive radar antennas mounted on the wings. So this was indeed a German night fighter, possibly hunting for American bombers returning from raids deeper into Germany. The irony wasn't lost on Hayes. He was a night fighter hunting a night fighter, both aircraft specially equipped to kill in the darkness. The tactical situation required careful consideration. The Focke-Wulf pilot might not know Hayes was behind him yet, but that could change in seconds if the Germans' radar detected the Black Widow or if the pilot happened to glance in the right direction. Hayes needed to end this quickly with a single decisive burst, rather than getting drawn into a prolonged engagement where luck and skill would matter more than technology. He closed to 200 yards, closer than his previous engagement, wanting to ensure maximum hit probability against the smaller, more agile target. The Focke-Wulf continued straight and level, its pilot apparently unaware of the danger behind him. Hayes aligned his illuminated gunsight reticle on the German fighter's fuselage, just behind the cockpit where the fuel tanks were located. His finger tightened on the firing button, hesitated for just a fraction of a second as his conscience reminded him this was another human being in his sights, then pressed down firmly. The 420mm cannon erupted again, and this time Hayes could see every round impact against the target. The Focke-Wulf seemed to stagger in the air as cannon shells tore through its structure. Pieces of aluminum skin fluttered away like metallic leaves. The canopy shattered, and Hayes caught a glimpse of the pilot jerking forward against his harness as rounds punched through the armor plate behind his seat. Then, the fighter's fuel tanks exploded, transforming the aircraft into a tumbling fireball that spiraled toward the ground, trailing smoke and burning fuel. Hayes watched long enough to confirm the kill, then immediately began scanning the sky for other threats. Night fighting demanded constant vigilance because the very darkness that concealed you from the enemy also concealed the enemy from you. Even with radar, there were blind spots and limitations, angles where an attacking aircraft might approach undetected. But the sky remained empty, except for the falling wreckage of his second victim. And after a few minutes, Hayes allowed himself to relax slightly. 2 confirmed kills in 1 sortie, Caldwell said with satisfaction evident in his voice. The intelligence boys are going to be happy with this report. Yeah, but how many are left? Hayes replied, his tone more somber. We shoot down 2, and the Luftwaffe puts up 20 more tomorrow night. This war feels like it's never going to end. It'll end when we kill enough of them that they quit, Caldwell said pragmatically, and nights like this help reach that number faster. The Black Widow headed back toward its base in eastern France, a captured German airfield that had been rapidly repaired and turned into an operational Allied facility. The flight home gave Hayes time to think about the broader context of what he was doing. Every German aircraft destroyed represented not just a tactical victory, but a strategic degradation of the enemy's capability to resist. The Luftwaffe had started the war with thousands of aircraft and highly trained crews. Now, in early 1945, those numbers had dwindled dramatically through years of attrition. Experienced pilots had been killed or captured, manufacturing capacity had been bombed into rubble, and fuel shortages meant training for new pilots was minimal at best. Landing a P-61 at night required concentration and skill that never became completely routine, no matter how many times you'd done it. The aircraft's tricycle landing gear configuration made ground handling easier than conventional taildragger designs, but the wide wingspan meant careful attention to runway alignment. Hayes brought the Black Widow in on a long, straight final approach, using visual references from the runway lights to judge his altitude and descent rate. The main gear touched down smoothly, and he lowered the nose wheel gently before applying brakes and throttling back the engines. The big fighter rolled to a stop at the end of the runway, and Hayes taxied toward the revetment where ground crews waited to service and rearm the aircraft for the next mission. After shutting down and completing the post-flight inspection, Hayes and Caldwell met with the intelligence officer for debriefing. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, a sharp former teacher from Minnesota who had volunteered for military service and ended up in intelligence work through some bureaucratic accident she'd never fully understood, took detailed notes as the crew described their mission. She asked specific questions about the timing of each interception, the radar ranges at which contact was made, the target's behavior, and the results of engagement. "You're both building quite a reputation," Morrison said as she finished her notes with a slight smile. 6 confirmed kills between you in 3 months. That puts you in the top 5% of night fighter crews in the European theater. Hayes shrugged, suddenly feeling exhausted as the adrenaline drained from his system. "The airplane does most of the work. We just point it in the right direction. Don't sell yourself short. Plenty of crews have P-61s and aren't racking up numbers like yours. You're doing something right." Morrison closed her notebook and stood. "Get some rest. Weather forecasts suggest tomorrow night will be clear, which means the Germans will probably be active again." Walking back to the quarters they shared with other air crews, Hayes and Caldwell passed several other Black Widows parked in their revetments, their glossy black paint making them look like malevolent insects crouching in the darkness. Each aircraft represented millions of dollars of investment, thousands of hours of engineering and manufacturing, and the concentrated effort of American industrial capacity. The fact that America could produce such sophisticated weapons in large quantities while simultaneously fighting wars in both Europe and the Pacific spoke to an economic advantage that Germany could never hope to match. The next morning, Hayes woke late after sleeping through the noise of daylight operations. He spent the afternoon writing letters home, including one to his parents describing his life in France in carefully vague terms that wouldn't violate operational security. He mentioned the food, which was adequate but nothing compared to his mother's cooking. He described some of the other pilots and crew members, their personalities and quirks. He talked about the French countryside, the small villages still showing scars from years of occupation and liberation. What he didn't mention was the combat, the killing, the nightmares that occasionally jolted him awake in the small hours of darkness. Those things weren't for letters home. That evening, as crews prepared for another night of operations, word came through intelligence channels that several German aircraft had been reported operating in their assigned sector. Reconnaissance suggested at least 3 bombers and possibly 2 fighters conducting raids on Allied supply depots. Hayes and Caldwell were assigned to patrol a specific corridor where intercepts were most likely, essentially setting up an aerial ambush zone where any German aircraft would have to pass through their coverage area. They took off just after sunset, climbing into the gathering darkness as the last light faded from the western horizon. Caldwell powered up the radar system and began the systematic scan pattern that would hopefully detect any German aircraft entering their patrol zone. For the first hour, nothing appeared. The sky remained empty except for a few Allied transports, following designated corridors well away from the combat zone. Hayes flew a racetrack pattern at 15,000 feet, turning back and forth along a 50-mile line that covered the most likely approach routes. "Contact," Caldwell suddenly announced, his voice sharp with renewed focus after an hour of tedious searching. "Bearing 270, range 15 miles, multiple targets." "Multiple," Hayes confirmed, his pulse accelerating as he turned toward the new heading. 3 distinct radar returns flying in loose formation. Range closing, 14 miles now. "They're heading almost directly toward us." This was different from previous missions where Hayes had hunted single aircraft. Engaging multiple targets meant prioritizing which one to attack first, managing ammunition carefully, and being aware that the other aircraft would likely become alert after the first one was destroyed. It also meant increased danger, as even bombers could put up defensive fire if they knew they were under attack. Hayes turned toward the intercept heading and began analyzing the tactical situation rapidly in his mind. 3 aircraft in loose formation suggested a bomber mission rather than fighters, as German night fighters typically operated alone or in pairs rather than larger groups. The approaching aircraft were probably heading for Allied positions with bomb loads, intending to strike targets under cover of darkness. If Hayes and Caldwell could intercept them before they reached their targets, they'd not only get 3 kills, but also prevent whatever damage those bombs might have caused. Range 10 miles. They're maintaining formation and course, Caldwell updated with the precision of a man who had done this dozens of times before. Altitude approximately 12,000 feet, about 3,000 below us. Hayes began a gradual descent, planning to approach from above and behind once again, using the height advantage that gave him options. He could dive to convert altitude into speed if needed, or maintain position and choose his moment to attack. The challenge with multiple targets was preventing the survivors from scattering after the first engagement. If they broke formation and fled in different directions, he might only be able to chase down 1 or 2 of them. At 5 miles distance, Hayes could see the targets clearly now, 3 dark shapes against the slightly lighter ground below. They appeared to be Heinkel 111 bombers, another versatile German design used for various roles throughout the war. These examples were definitely configured for bombing, evident from the external ordnance visible beneath their wings and fuselages even at this distance. Hayes estimated each aircraft was carrying at least 2,000 pounds of bombs, enough to cause serious damage if they reached their intended targets. He made his decision quickly, the way combat pilots learn to do when hesitation could mean death. The rightmost aircraft in the formation was slightly separated from the other 2, making it the easiest target without alerting the others immediately. Hayes positioned himself 400 yards behind and slightly below the trailing Heinkel, aligned his gun sight with the practiced ease of repetition, and pressed the firing button without the hesitation that had marked his earlier kills. The familiar chattering roar of the cannon filled the cockpit, and red tracers streaked through the darkness to converge on the German bomber with lethal precision. The effect was devastating and immediate. Hayes's burst, lasting approximately 4 seconds, sent nearly 70 cannon rounds toward the Heinkel. At least 30 found their mark, tearing through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin and destroying vital systems with the efficiency of a surgeon's scalpel applied to flesh. The bomber's port wing folded upward at an impossible angle as the main spar was severed by multiple hits. The aircraft entered an uncontrollable roll, its structural integrity compromised beyond any possibility of recovery. Within seconds, the Heinkel was tumbling toward the ground, pieces breaking off as aerodynamic forces exceeded the strength of damaged metal. The other 2 bombers reacted immediately to the destruction of their companion, their survival instincts overriding whatever mission discipline they'd maintained. Both aircraft broke formation violently, one turning hard left while the other banked right and dove for lower altitude in desperate attempts to escape. The neat tactical problem of engaging 3 aircraft in formation had just become significantly more complicated. Hayes had to choose which target to pursue, knowing the other would likely escape into the darkness. "Go after the one diving," Caldwell suggested quickly, tracking both aircraft on his radar scope with practiced efficiency. He's heading away from Allied positions. The other one is still on course toward our lines. Hayes agreed instantly and pushed the Black Widow's nose down, building speed in pursuit of the descending Heinkel. The German pilot was good, clearly experienced, varying his dive angle and adding turning maneuvers to make himself a difficult target to track. But the P-61 had a significant speed advantage in a dive, and Hayes closed the gap steadily, despite the evasive maneuvers. At 8,000 feet altitude, he pulled into firing range and triggered another burst, his muscle memory taking over the precise movements required. This time, his accuracy wasn't as good, due to the constantly changing angles and the violent maneuvering, but enough rounds hit to cause visible damage. Fire erupted from the Heinkel's starboard engine, bright orange flames streaming back along the cowling, and the bomber leveled out abruptly as the pilot fought to maintain control of his crippled aircraft. Hayes fired again, a longer burst that expended precious ammunition but ensured the kill with brutal finality. The second stream of cannon fire raked the length of the bomber's fuselage, destroying the cockpit and flight controls in a matter of seconds. The Heinkel nosed over into a vertical dive and impacted the ground at high speed, creating a brief fireball as its fuel and bombs detonated simultaneously in a massive explosion that lit up the countryside below. "The third bomber is still heading for our lines," Caldwell reported urgently, his voice tight with the knowledge that German bombs might find Allied targets if they couldn't stop this last aircraft. "Bearing 090, range 8 miles from our current position." Hayes pulled the Black Widow into a punishing climbing turn, pushing the big fighter to its performance limits in ways that would have made the Northrop engineers nervous. His vision grayed at the edges from G-forces, and he heard the airframe groaning under the stress of the violent maneuver. But he needed altitude and speed to catch the remaining Heinkel before it reached its target. The bomber had gained precious time while Hayes dealt with its companion, and now it was a race to see if the Black Widow could close the distance before the German pilot could release his bombs on Allied soldiers below. For 10 long minutes, Hayes pushed the P-61 at maximum continuous power, the twin engines roaring at settings that consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Slowly, incrementally, the distance decreased with agonizing gradualism. 7 miles, 6, 5. Caldwell called out updates with mechanical precision, his voice the only sound besides the engine noise, and Hayes's own rapid breathing as he concentrated on squeezing every ounce of performance from his aircraft. At 3 miles distance, Hayes could see the bomber silhouetted against the horizon, still desperately fleeing toward its target with what must have been full throttle. At 1 mile distance, the Heinkel pilot must have realized he couldn't escape, that the invisible hunter on his tail was too fast and too persistent. The bomber suddenly pitched upward into a steep climb, then rolled inverted and released its bombs in the general direction of the Allied lines in a desperate attempt to complete some portion of the mission. The bombs fell harmlessly into empty countryside, their explosions creating brief flashes of light miles short of any valuable targets. Having dropped his ordnance, the German pilot pushed his aircraft into a wild, evasive dive, throwing the bomber through maneuvers it was never designed to perform in a last desperate attempt to shake off pursuit and save his crew. Hayes followed patiently, waiting for the right moment rather than wasting ammunition on low-probability shots that might miss entirely. The Heinkel's wild maneuvering was burning the bomber's energy rapidly, bleeding off speed and altitude with every aggressive turn. After 2 minutes of violent evasion that must have been terrifying for the German crew, the pilot found himself at 4,000 feet altitude and less than 200 miles per hour airspeed, on the edge of stalling with a fresh Black Widow positioned perfectly astern like a patient executioner. Hayes fired his final burst of the engagement, and this time there was no drama or spectacular explosion to mark the kill. The cannon rounds simply punched through the Heinkel's structure with methodical efficiency, destroying the hydraulic system, severing control cables, and killing the pilot with a round that penetrated the armored seatback. The bomber nosed over gently and flew itself into the ground at a shallow angle, disintegrating on impact without the fireball that had marked the other kills, just a sudden crumpling of metal and the extinguishing of 4 more lives. 3 for 3, Caldwell said quietly, his voice containing none of the triumph that might have been expected. "Hell of a night's work." Hayes didn't reply immediately, his hands still gripping the control yoke with unnecessary tightness, his body still flooded with the adrenaline of combat, even though the immediate danger had passed. 12 men had just died because of his actions over the past 20 minutes, 12 human beings with their own stories and families and hopes for survival. 12 men who would never go home to their families, never eat another meal or read another book or feel sunshine on their faces. The intellectual understanding that this was war, that those men were trying to kill Allied soldiers, that their deaths prevented future attacks, all of that felt hollow in the immediate aftermath of killing. "Let's go home," Hayes finally said, his voice flat with exhaustion that went beyond the physical. The flight back to base was quiet, both crew members lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just done. The Black Widow had performed flawlessly once again, its radar guiding them to 3 successful intercepts, its cannon destroying all 3 targets with terrible efficiency. But the aircraft's technical excellence couldn't eliminate the human cost of what it enabled, couldn't erase the knowledge that technology had made killing easier than ever before in human history. Landing and post-flight procedures passed in a blur of routine actions performed on autopilot. Morrison conducted another debriefing, taking notes on the triple kill with professional enthusiasm that Hayes found difficult to match. Other pilots congratulated Hayes and Caldwell on their success, discussing the tactical details of engaging multiple targets with the clinical interest of professionals, analyzing a particularly difficult problem. But Hayes felt disconnected from it all, watching himself go through the motions as though observing from outside his own body. Over the following weeks, Hayes and Caldwell flew another 12 missions, adding 4 more confirmed kills to their total that made them minor celebrities within the night fighter community. Each mission followed the same basic pattern: takeoff into darkness, hours of patrol searching for targets, the sudden spike of adrenaline when radar contact was made, the calculated stalk toward firing position, the brief violence of cannon fire, the burning wreckage spiraling toward Earth. It became almost routine, like any other job performed repeatedly. That routinization troubled Hayes more than the actual killing did, suggesting that he was becoming desensitized to violence in ways that couldn't be healthy. The war's progress became increasingly evident in the decreasing number of German aircraft they encountered on their patrols. Where once they might make 2 or 3 intercepts per mission, now they sometimes flew entire sorties without finding a single target. The Luftwaffe was dying, not from a single catastrophic defeat, but from accumulated attrition across thousands of engagements on every front. Every crew killed, every aircraft destroyed, every gallon of fuel burned made it harder for the Germans to continue meaningful resistance. In April 1945, as Allied ground forces pushed deeper into Germany from both east and west, crushing the Reich between 2 unstoppable armies, the night missions changed character entirely. Instead of hunting bombers attacking Allied positions, Hayes and Caldwell found themselves flying interdiction missions against German transport aircraft, trying to evacuate personnel and equipment from surrounded positions. These missions felt less like combat and more like execution, as overloaded transport planes struggled to escape at low altitudes and slow speeds, making themselves easy targets for radar-equipped fighters. Hayes destroyed 6 transport aircraft in one particularly brutal night, knowing that each transport likely carried dozens of soldiers who never stood a chance against his cannon. The end came suddenly when it finally arrived. On the 8th of May, 1945, word came through official channels that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hayes received the news with mixed emotions: relief that he would no longer have to fly combat missions, warring with a strange emptiness where the driving purpose of the previous months had been. For so long, his entire existence had been focused on hunting and killing German aircraft. Now that purpose had evaporated overnight, leaving him uncertain about what came next. In the weeks following the surrender, Hayes had time to reflect on what the P-61 Black Widow had accomplished during its relatively brief combat career in Europe. The aircraft had arrived late to the war, not seeing action until mid-1944, yet it had fundamentally changed the nature of night combat in ways the Germans never anticipated. The combination of radar, heavy armament, and trained crews had made the night sky as dangerous for the Luftwaffe as daylight had become. German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft that had once operated with relative impunity under cover of darkness found themselves hunted by invisible predators they couldn't see or evade. The psychological impact on German crews had been profound. Survivors of Black Widow attacks reported the terror of being struck without warning, of watching their aircraft disintegrate from cannon fire that seemed to come from nowhere. Some German pilots refused to fly night missions after witnessing what the American radar-equipped fighters could do. The Luftwaffe had tried desperately to develop countermeasures, but by the time they understood what they were facing, Germany lacked the resources and time to respond effectively. Hayes learned that his squadron alone had destroyed over 80 German aircraft during the final months of the war, with minimal losses to their own forces. Other P-61 units had achieved similar results across the European theater. The Black Widow had proven that technology could shift the balance of combat decisively when applied correctly. That innovation and industrial capacity could overcome enemy advantages in experience or tactics. Standing beside his Black Widow for the last time before it was flown back to the United States for storage, Hayes ran his hand along the glossy black fuselage that had kept him alive through dozens of missions. The aircraft had been more than just a machine. It had been a partner, a weapon, and a shield all at once. It had given him capabilities that no pilot in history had possessed before 1944. The ability to see in complete darkness, to hunt enemies who thought they were safe, to strike with devastating precision when visual sight was impossible. Caldwell joined him by the aircraft, both men silent as they looked at the fighter that had defined their war experience. "Think they'll need these in the Pacific?" Caldwell finally asked. Hayes shook his head slowly. "War there will probably be over before we could get deployed. And from what I hear, the B-29s are handling things well enough." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm not sure I want to go back to it anyway. I think I've done enough killing for one lifetime." Morrison appeared with their final paperwork, orders sending them back to the United States for reassignment or possible discharge. "You two did good work here," she said simply. "The reports show your crew was among the most effective in the theater. The P-61 proved itself because of pilots like you." Hayes accepted the papers, but couldn't quite bring himself to feel proud. Yes, they'd been effective. Yes, they'd destroyed many enemy aircraft and probably saved Allied lives by preventing German bombing missions. But effectiveness in killing didn't feel like something worthy of celebration, even when it was necessary. The faces of burning aircraft, the knowledge of men dying in flames, those memories would stay with him long after the medals and congratulations faded. In the end, the P-61 Black Widow had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. It had taken control of the night sky from the Luftwaffe, demonstrating that American technology and industrial power could create weapons the enemy never expected and couldn't counter. The Germans had believed the night would always provide sanctuary from Allied fighters, a belief built on years of experience and the limitations of previous technology. The Black Widow shattered that belief permanently, proving that in modern warfare there was no safe haven, no time when the enemy couldn't reach you. As Hayes boarded the transport that would take him home to Oregon, he thought about the farm he'd left behind, the simple work of planting and harvesting, of maintaining equipment and watching things grow rather than watching them burn. He'd volunteered to fly fighters because he'd wanted to serve his country, to be part of something larger than himself. He'd succeeded in that goal, becoming one of the most effective night fighter pilots in the European theater. But success in war came with a price measured in memories that never quite faded, in knowledge of what you were capable of doing when circumstances required it. The P-61 Black Widow would go on to serve in the Pacific Theater and later in the Korean War, though never again with the same decisive impact it had achieved against the Luftwaffe in those final months of the European War. Technology would continue advancing, with jet engines and guided missiles eventually making propeller-driven night fighters obsolete. But for a brief moment in history, the Black Widow had been the most advanced, most capable night fighter in the world, and it had used that advantage to devastating effect against an enemy who never saw it coming until it was too late. Germany had dominated the night skies for years, But they never expected an American fighter to carry radar sophisticated enough to hunt them in complete darkness, and that miscalculation had cost them dearly in the final months of the war.